All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, one of the central ideas that we hit often on this show is the idea of theory of change. Outside versus inside, grassroots versus top-down, negotiate versus revolution. Well, Bernie Sanders just gave a lengthy and truly fascinating interview to Michael Barbara over at the New York Times podcast, The Daily. It was written up for print by Alex Burns. They decided to focus in on Bernie's stunning 10-vote victory to become mayor of Burlington, Vermont back in 1981. Now, up to that point, he'd run a series of protest campaigns, always garnering just a few points. But in this case, he caught the entitled incumbent sleeping, built an unprecedented coalition of working-class people, and eked out a stunning victory. A socialist mayor coming to power at the height of the Cold War.
Face it, you don't find too many socialists in elective office in this country, and one is elected mayor of a sizable city. Well, that's news. It's also Phil Donahue's topic this morning.
Good morning, Jane. A couple of facts. Burlington is the largest city in Vermont. The state has about 500,000 people. Burlington has about 38,000. Situated as it is on Lake Champlain with the Adirondack Mountains viewable, it's a lovely, lovely spot in this country. We'd like you to meet its new mayor. This is Mayor Bernard Sanders. Mayor Sanders got a lot of attention recently, not only with his 10-vote victory out of about 9,500 votes cast, but mostly because he is a socialist. And everybody reading that article said, my goodness, how did this happen in good old conservative Vermont?
So amazing. Now, the story of the campaign itself is very interesting. Burlington was essentially a one-party town. The Democrats had such a lock on City Hall, and also there was so little difference between them and the GOP that the Republicans weren't even bothering to field a candidate. But Sanders noticed that in his previous quixotic statewide races, he'd actually vastly overperformed in the working-class neighborhoods of Burlington. An early indication maybe that fed-up working-class citizens were desperate for an anti-establishment alternative. So he decided to run, figuring out electoral politics on the fly, stunning the political establishment and really honestly the entire nation. What really fascinated me, though, was what happened after he was elected. So there he was after this stunning upset as mayor of Burlington, and all of the powers that be, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, decided, in Sanders' words, that he was a fluke, that since they still had control of the Board of Aldermen, basically their city council, they could just obstruct him completely, keep him from accomplishing absolutely anything, and then everything could get back to normal. In words frequently applied these days to Donald Trump, he was an aberration. So the Board of Aldermen blocked all of his key appointments. They even blocked his secretary. He was forced to try to run the city with all of his predecessors' obstructionist people. In the interview, Sanders compares this situation to Trump having to run the government with all of Obama's cabinet members, which, of course, is more or less what Trump thinks has happened to him. But while Trump has collapsed into an endless stream of conspiracy mongering and Twitter grievances, Sanders actually figured out how to get around that obstruction and govern the city according to his values. So what did he do? Well, he got together some of his top supporters and formed essentially a shadow government to help craft and execute on ideas. He also relied directly on the people of the city, delegating power to neighborhood councils. Each borough was given its own budget that it could allocate independently to suit the needs of the community. So 1 year into his administration, 7 of the 13 aldermen were up for re-election in what Sanders describes as essentially a referendum on his administration. This was truly a do-or-die moment for him. Would his political revolution be upheld or rejected in Burlington? So Sanders fields his own slate of 5 candidates. He tells the New York Times that he works harder than he's ever worked in his life, knocking on almost literally every door of the city with the candidates by his side. And when all the votes are counted, 3 of Sanders' candidates have won outright, and 2 forced the incumbents into runoffs. The remaining Democrats were actually forced to team up with the Republicans in order to keep control of the board. It was the Burlington equivalent of Chuck Schumer voting for Mitch McConnell for majority leader. But perhaps most significantly, in 1 year's time, Sanders doubled voter turnout, dramatically increasing the level of popular participation and bringing the citizens back into engagement with their city government. Sanders could no longer be written off as a fluke, but rather a force in his own right with a base of power independent from any political party. He then went on to win re-election 3 times, including once against a candidate who was backed by both major parties because, you know, the one thing that brings establishment Democrats and Republicans together is their commitment to defeating anyone with their own working-class base of support. He told the New York Times, "What that tells me is that if government does respond to the needs of working people, they will come out and participate. It's a simple statement, but one at such odds with the suppression, manipulation, caricature, and derision that working people are typically subjected to. To me, this interview was so revealing because you can see all of the parallels with his political philosophy and theory of change today. He has faith in this idea of a political revolution because he's done it and he's seen it. Remember this moment recently when John Harwood asked how he would handle someone like Joe Manchin opposing Medicare for All. Take a listen.
Is Joe Manchin going to vote for your program? Yeah. Is John Tester going to vote for your
program?
Damn
right they will. You know why? And they're friends of mine.
Yeah.
Because we're going to go to West Virginia, which is maybe the poorest state, well, one of the poorest states in this country. Look, what happens right now, your average politician sits around and he or she thinks, they say, let's see, if I do this, I'm going to have the big money interest putting 30-second ads against me. So I better not do it. But now they're going to have to think, if I don't support an agenda that works for working people, I'm going to have President Sanders come into my state and rally working class people. You know what? At the end of the day, the 1% is very powerful. No denying that. Mm-hmm. The 99%, when they're organized and prepared to stand up and fight, they are far more powerful.
So just as he did in Burlington, Sanders is putting his faith not in some mythical negotiating power like Trump did, or in some fantasy of coming to the table in good faith negotiations with Mitch McConnell like Biden and Obama and Buttigieg do, or even in his ability to jiu-jitsu the levers of government through superior bureaucratic knowledge as Warren does. He believes, just as he did in Burlington, that the only way to break the back of congressional gridlock and inertia and neoliberal entrenchment is by putting your faith in the people, in serving as organizer-in-chief. Now, obviously, the federal government is quite a bit different than Burlington, Vermont. There are way more corrupt lawmakers, lobbyists, and donors all sucking at the government teat. An entire national media is arrayed against you, just looking for damaging links and to spin stories to destroy you in every way possible. But you've also got a lot more citizens available to have your back. And you've got new modes of communicating to circumvent the elite media, something Sanders has very deliberately cultivated, even from his very earliest days. And here's the other thing that he's counting on. Just as he doubled voter participation in Burlington, breaking the back of the establishment lock on city politics, if McConnell and Manchin and Pelosi et al. Stand in his way and block passage of popular legislation to benefit the working class citizens, he is counting on a reckoning, on a massive show of electoral force that would bring a tidal wave of new voters into the system, creating a new accountability for those who would stand in their way. That is what political revolution looked like in Burlington, and that is what he believes it will look like in D.C. as well. This interview was so fascinating.
It is.
Because to see the way that all these entrenched forces did everything they could to obstruct him, first of all, it obviously informs his very oppositional stance to the Democratic Party throughout his career. Right, yeah. It also had echoes of Trump and what happened here in this city when he came to power, and he had not only the Democrats, of course, resisting him, not only the sort of legacy bureaucratic officials, but the establishment Republicans that often he actually brought into his administration.
No, and his theory is not wrong. I mean, look at why is Donald Trump in the White House? Because he overperformed his polls by 2%, because those 2% were people that were not polled. They were right. People who didn't vote. We hear from the Trump campaign all the time. It's like 25% of the people who currently attend their rallies are people who have not voted in the last 4 presidential elections. That's a lot of people. And so really what it is that so much of the current working class of America are non-voters. They just don't vote because they have no faith in the political establishment. They have no faith in political leaders. Chris Arnott, he's got a great Twitter feed, great book. We were talking earlier, and he said that he interviewed people in communities like Gary, Indiana, which is like 90% black, and a black man he was talking to, he said, why don't you vote? And he said, look, he's like, you see these potholes? He's like, they've been here under Obama, they were there under Bush, and they started under Clinton. So he's like, his point was, nothing has changed in my entire life from a politician. And so unless you fundamentally change the way that you're going to have your relationship with the system and the way that you have a relationship to politics, only the current voting population is going to continue making decisions when so much of the country still just doesn't vote.
Well, and that's his theory, which is very simple, which is if you actually respond to the material interests and needs of the working class citizens, they will participate. And he bases that on the fact that he doubled participation in Burlington, which is so interesting. There's also this very interesting moment in the podcast. They play some of the footage. He had this like public access cable like TV show that he did. It was called Bernie Talks to the Community or something like like that, where he would literally just like grab people off the street to engage with them, which again is very much, you can see that thread throughout his career to today, where because he always has assumed that the media is also going to be oppositional, whether it's on the local level or the national level, he's always built these outside media channels so that he can communicate directly with the voters. So it was also fascinating just to see that thread develop throughout his career too.
No, the career is very interesting. I mean, look, it's Bernie, right? Like, he's the original. I mean, he really did pioneers.
He was from the beginning.
The same thing from the very beginning, and it's comforting, right?
Yeah, that whole you should watch that whole Today Show thing that I pulled the clip from. The whole interview is hilarious, and yes, he sounds exactly the same. So next on Rising, friend of the show Jennifer Holdsworth is going to tell us how the Buttigieg campaign is preparing for the December debate,
and how Mayor Pete might distinguish himself in a winnowing field when Rising continues.